Everybody, wherever you're located. I appreciate you taking the opportunity to come to today's webinar. This is a kind of a follow-on webinar from one we did a couple of years ago, doing a little bit of an update to this topic, and we thought it was time to readdress the topic with a continued visibility that we're having that organizations are still struggling with this topic. So we thought we would do a follow-up webinar from an original webinar we did a couple of years ago, and give you guys an opportunity to ask questions and present some new material as well in this context. So the title of today's webinar is Oracle E-Business Suite, SQL Forms, Risks, and Controls. And I'm the presenter, Jeffrey Hare, and I'm joined by Phil Ryman, who's our Director of Business Development. He'll be fielding questions towards the end and kind of keeping things on track, keeping me honest. So our agenda today is I'm going to introduce myself just briefly. We're going to talk about some overall system risks that are relevant to this topic. What are SQL Forms, risks related to SQL Forms, the use of them, and we're going to go through two scenarios and then talk about what are the best practices for monitoring the activity. So how are we going to put controls in place to monitor the risks, and then some wrap-up. So my name is Jeffrey Hare. I'm a CPA by trade. Also have designation CISA, Certified Information Systems Auditor, and CIA, Certified Internal Auditor. I'm the founder of ERP Risk Advisors, the Oracle Users Best Practices Board. And then most of you probably know that I've released a book a couple years ago, the only book of its kind on application security best practices, called Oracle E-Business Suite Controls, Application Security Best Practices, and have been widely publicized in OEG's magazine, as well as ISACA and ACFE magazines. So we're going to start off right away with a poll. Just for those of you that want CPE, this is pretty standard information, but there's 5 polls we're going to do. You need to respond to at least 4 polls during the webinar and beyond for at least 50 minutes. So we're going to start off with a poll, and we didn't ask this in the questions to start, but we're going to ask just up front, who needs a CPE certificate so we can capture that information. So I'll launch this poll and give you guys just a few seconds here to respond. Looks like we have about 35 people on the call today, which is good. Had about 85 registered, so I suspect we may get a few stragglers coming in the next few minutes here. So if you need a CPE certificate for whatever, for your CPA, CIA, CISA, CISSP, or anything like that, now is the time to ask. And if for some reason you can vote in this poll later, you can send us an email if we don't send you one. So going to close this poll for now. It looks like about everybody's had a chance to vote. We'll get right into the meat of the presentation. So what I wanted to start talking about some overall system risks. These are some topics I talk about quite commonly in webinars, just so people make sure they understand these in the context of overall security risks. So 3 of my favorite topics: deficiencies regarding audit trails, deficiencies in change management practices, and deficiencies in implementation practices. So the first thing we're going to talk about is audit trail deficiencies, and this is a common thread, a common topic to ERP systems in general, but we're specifically talking about E-Business Suite today. And that being the primary point being the audit trail is only kept where the application is built to do so. So talking about audit trail is when there's an insert, update, or a deletion statement, so an IU or a D, or what we call a DML statement, that the system is tracking the activity behind the scenes. So an insert would show a value for the first time, and a delete would show the value being deleted, and an update would show before and after value. The ERP systems, like E-Business Suite, don't have what I would call an audit all functionality. So like in a mainframe system, if you had a developer or a programmer or an analyst go in and monitor, or maintain certain information, data, or files, that there would be the ability to audit everything they're doing when they go in that. That information doesn't exist in an average ERP system, and E-Business Suite is no exception to that. So there's really a what we call lack of detailed audit trail throughout the application. And there's certain areas where the application is built to have that audit trail. But by and large, 95 to 98% of the application, when a change is made, that change is not stored and tracked. All you're seeing is just the latest information. So I've got my favorite example here I've used for several years. I've used this in my book and in several webinars. So I'm going to talk about a realistic scenario using the journal sources form. So this is the journal sources form, which is a key configuration for journal approval workflow, which is typically, if you're using a key control from a Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX perspective. And there's several things on this table that get maintained. There's really two key things that get maintained on a regular basis or could get maintained. The first thing is the freeze journals column. You're seeing that in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And then the require a journal approval column. So as it stands right now, this screenshot shows freeze journals is checked. And so what we're just noting here is that that's checked. The record shows the last update value of January 3rd, 2007 with a timestamp of 2152. So in this example, I'm unchecking that box. So I'm logged in as a user, JTH9891, and you see the box is unchecked. And it now shows the updated by value is my name, JTH9891, and the updated date has changed to the current time, which happens to be back in 2008 when I developed this illustration. So you're seeing August 21st, 2008 with a timestamp of 1643. And now I'm going to make this change, retick it, tick the box. So two minutes later, it goes from 1643 to 1645, the timestamp, and it updates the updated by or update date. So that's what we're really illustrating here is what's happening behind the scenes. For each record that's created in the database, there's this created by and creation date and the updated by and updated date information. That's what typically is referred to as the row who information. About this record form we're seeing here is only available in what we call professional forms. It's not available in OA framework pages or HTML pages. So that's why I always use this illustration, because it's easiest to see this about this record or this row who information. So in and of itself, the important thing to note here is that the updated by information is changed, but if I went to the database, there would be no place where I could see the change and the change back. There wouldn't be a full audit trail history of that. Now, where that becomes important is in cases where you have an application control, a configuration related to an application control, like this is the case. So this happens to be a change to the freeze journals box, which probably is not a key configuration related to Sarbanes-Oxley or an application control. But the required journal approval one would be. That determines, of all the different sources that you have in your system, payables, manual, receivables, spreadsheet, so on and so forth, which ones of those go through your journal approval workflow process. So in my example here, if I was an auditor coming in and looking at the application control from a reliability perspective, has this application, the configuration related to this application control changed in my audit period? In this case, I made a change to a freeze journals box. But since I don't have the audit trail of knowing which column was changed, I know something within the context of that row was changed, but I don't have a detailed audit trail. An auditor, I could question whether or not the require a journal approval checkbox got changed. And without a sufficient detailed audit trail to be able to back up that it was not the require journal approval box, but it was the freeze journal box, an auditor would have a reasonable basis to say, we're not going to let you rely upon that application control during this audit period. So they may come in and say, we're going to downgrade this from an application control, relying upon an application control and require manual testing for this particular control. Now the control in this case would be a journal approval process. And for them to come in and downgrade the application control to a manual control would mean a substantial amount of additional audit time frame, substantive testing, and that inevitably would increase, in this scenario, it would increase your audit fees related to the audit of this particular control. So this topic has practical implications in that It's not just theoretical, that we want to, have a better secure environment and have better controls, but this actually could lead to some additional costs, which is why it's so important. So what we've laid out here is the lack of audit trail. This is definitely applicable directly to the SQL Forms topic we're going to look at today. This is just another way to look at this same information in a table format I put together, where the freeze journals is checked, unchecked, and then checked back, and the whole history of this. So it does tell us what was changed, or who changed, that made the change, and what the date of the last change was, but it doesn't tell us the details of what was changed, and that's a pretty critical thing from auditor's perspective. So there's actually a recorded webinar that goes into a lot more detail on this topic called Building an Audit Trail in an EBS Environment. That's available on our website. And I've got the topic on this, or the chapter on this topic from my book has been released in the public domain if you want to look at it. It's Chapter 6, and that's available at our homepage as well, erpra.net. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is change management. So the change management process, how it's designed, how it's implemented, how it's monitored is another critical thread, and frankly, it's something that many organizations still struggle with, having a complete and thorough change management process. So just going to cover a couple topics here just briefly before we get into SQL Forms. The purpose really of a change management process is to protect the integrity of the data and related business process. So the question I always ask, are system configurations relevant to the design and performance of the business process, and for that matter, the integrity of the data? And the answer to that is, of course it is. So most organizations, as it relates to database logins in a production environment, they have those pretty tightly controlled, and they would say, well, we only have a limited number of DBAs that can access the database. We have a very tightly controlled process. When somebody wants to make an ad hoc SQL statement, update a table, or either a seeded table or a custom table, they've got pretty good controls on that. So the third kind of section here is, would you let a developer change the code related to a process that was without going through your change management process, or would you let the developer make a change to, would you allow them to have access to the app's password, which is providing them both the ability to update data in and of itself, and update the DDL, or data definition language, the structure of the database itself. And the answer to most of you would say developers or anybody outside of the DBA staff is not authorized to either use the app's password or to make any other code change without going through the change management process. So we're going to look at how that can be circumvented. Where I see the most struggle on the change management side, and I'm going to try to take a couple topics and then tie this back into the SQL Forms, but where I see the most struggles is the lack of a functional change management process or a business process change process. So most organizations do a really good job of what I would call object-oriented IT change management process, but to the extent that that impacts the business process, which would include changing controls, changing business process documentation, narratives, those type of things. There's less of a defined process for that, and I go back to changes to configurations in particular that are the highest areas of risk for most organizations. The second bullet is kind of similar to this, a failure to develop a non-IT executive ownership for the change management process with all disciplines. The executives outside of IT really need to have a change management-oriented process, a mentality, if you will, and they need to think, I need to protect the integrity of my data and my business process, which the system is part of that. And executives outside of the IT realm typically don't have as good of an understanding of what that means. They typically are a little bit more anxious to make changes because of the impact on business process, and sometimes there are critical changes that have to be made for customers, those type of things. And then you get sometimes a pushback or two sides of the fence, if you will, between the functional side and the IT side. So that's kind of what I mean by that non-IT executive ownership for the change management process. The third bullet is probably the most significant deficiency that I see organizations struggle with, which is a configuration change management process. I could do a whole webinar on just that topic in and of itself, and I won't do that, but I won't do that right now and go into all the detail, but needless to say, the configuration change management process starts from a proper risk assessment of which configuration should go through the change management process, a refinement of risks down to just those that are authorized to make the changes, and then some type of monitoring process for those configurations to make sure that your change management process is complete. I'm going to go skip the next one. Failure to develop the necessary audit trail, something we talked about just previously, that if you don't have a trigger or log-based auditing solution, you don't have an audit trail in detail to test for unauthorized changes. So I think we're going to talk about that more as we go on throughout the day. An informal application security change management process. When application security changes are introduced, there's more than just the impact on menus and request groups and responsibilities. There's an impact on your SOD controls, your single function risks, your security rules, potentially your business process itself, the process documentation related to that, potentially your controls. So most organizations focus on really, narrowing in on the element of is there an approval process related to it for application security changes. But there's a lot more that needs to be taken into consideration, a lot more robust elements to that, as I mentioned. And then the last one, failure to address risk related to forms that allow SQL statements to be embedded in them, which is what we're going to talk about today specifically. A couple more things here more on the implementation side. So this is talking about implementation practices that are more of the common challenges. Security is not built using the principle of least privilege. So more often than not, security is built from a principle of great privilege, and it's reduced, i.e. a principle of great privilege starts with the use of a standard super user menu. And a lot of times organizations will use menu and function exclusions to get that down to what they believe is an acceptable level of security. Whenever that approach is taken, inevitably I will come into an environment and review or audit or help upgrade security or what have you, and I see that the access for users is in excess of what would be there if you build it from the bottom up. So using the principle of least privilege, only assign them functions and menus that are appropriate for their job. Now it sounds like I'm splitting hairs there in that, the theory, when people are developing security, they often would believe that they're getting down to the principle of least privilege. But trust me on this, most implementation process projects don't do a very good job of building, security using the principle of least privilege, and there's always stuff left over. And that primarily leads to the second topic, is because seeded menus are used with function exclusions, and they don't catch everything that should be removed. The other thing that seeded menus being used leads to is functions being added during patching. So if you're using top-level menus, top-level super user menus, or super user seeded menus, or even some seeded submenus, and you think you've got things fairly well refined in your initial go live during the patching process, we've got several examples where this has happened. The additional menus or additional functions gets added to those menus or submenus, adding additional functionality that's not appropriate for users. And my best example I can give you is AZN menus. Most organizations didn't catch that around 11.5.4 a couple years back when they were introducing business process accelerators. AZN menus were introduced on all super users, and we are still finding organizations that haven't cleaned up AZN menus and the risks related to that. Next topic, focusing on SOD risks, not single function risks. There is as much risk that needs to be evaluated in looking at a user's access to a particular form or particular function, which we call single function risks, as there is access to SOD risks. A lot of auditors are still, some auditors are still viewing risk in the context of SOD and haven't fully developed their risk assessment approach or their audit approach to include the full population of single function risks or single access risks. Next topic down, allowance of super users with excessive access. From a support perspective, the model of support is typically much more wide open, and you have IT management and those that manage business analysts saying that they've got a group of super users or business analysts that need access to everything to support the application, and then they essentially, quote unquote, accept the risk related to those people. In most cases, well, I would say in all cases, they don't really fully understand the quote unquote acceptance of that risk and what that means. They just don't have enough information in some cases to be able to push back and say why that access, why a super user or a business analyst or a support person shouldn't be given access to a full super user responsibility. And the last topic here is seeded request groups. And I've talked about this quite a bit. Seeded request groups provide both a visibility, inquiry access, as well as update access. And whenever you're using a seeded request group, inevitably there's going to be some element of that, whether it's a sensitive data, sensitive reports, or update programs or interface type programs that shouldn't be assigned to all users. So those are just a few things on an overall basis before we get into the topic. So we're going to next look at your change management maturity. So poll 2 is a question of represents my organization's change management maturity, and this is allow multiple choices. So all key control configurations go through the change management process. A lot of organizations are doing that. All SQL Forms activity go through the change management process. That's probably less of 100% on that in the group. A trigger log-based audit trail has been created to track the activity, to monitor the activity in the change management process. And then we regularly reconcile system-level activity to change management approvals. And the last one is none of these apply. So there's a few choices here. I'm going to pause for a second, give you a chance to read through these, and pick your choices here before we move down. About half of you voted. You got the other half still have yet to put something in here. So again, if you're requiring or requesting CPE as part of this, you need to participate in these 4 out of the 5 polls. This is our second poll, so if you just joined recently, you still have an opportunity to answer polls 2 through 5 and get your CPE certificate at the end. We typically take a day or 2 to get those CPE certificates out, so I'll just be patient with what we ask. It's a little bit of a cumbersome process to get those out, manual. So anywho, that's change management. I think I'm going to close the poll down. It looks like just about everybody has voted that wants to vote. It's been on for about a minute and a half, so I'm going to close this. And I'm actually going to, I'll leave it open for a second. I'll give you the results here. 46% that all key control goes through change management, 27% that all SQL Forms, 16% of you have implemented a trigger or log-based solution, 22% are regularly reconciling system-level activity back to your change management process, and 37% said none of these apply. So maybe you're consultants or auditors, or maybe you don't know the answer to that question. So we're going to close that poll, back into the slides, and dive right into the main part of the material, which is looking at SQL Forms access. Or this really should be broadened beyond SQL Forms, because there's not just SQL Forms or SQL statements, but that's how I've labeled this. The concept really is embedded now. Oracle has moved from the terminology SQL Forms a few years ago to the secure configuration guide. So the 11i version of this was 189.367.1. The R12 version is 403.537.1. It used to be called Best Practices for Securing Your eBusiness Suite, and now it's called Secure Configuration Guide for Oracle eBusiness Suite Release 12. So the point being, if you haven't read through this document, number one, as an auditor, I would suggest you read through this document. And this, in and of itself, could be an audit of your applications environment. And I would go to your DBA team and your IT management and say, have you documented compliance? Have you documented and implemented compliance for all the steps within this document? It's a very critical document. There's a lot of organizations that haven't. They think that they have gotten through all these things. But more often than not, we find that there's still some substantial issues that need to be assessed. Now, The irony of it is even the best system implementers that we've talked to and as we've interacted with customers, that even the best system implementers aren't recommending that organizations go through this document fully before they go live. And I would highly recommend that be the case. Even if you don't implement everything that's in this document, you should have a plan for implementing everything prior to going live. So this would be a good document to hand to IT management. Say, can you tell me where you documented and implemented compliance for everything within this document, or at least to the extent that it's not applicable, documented why it's not applicable. So the key element here is we're looking at sensitive forms and sensitive OA framework pages. Is this last excerpt from this document. It says customers should eliminate or minimize access to these screens in a production environment and know exactly which users have access to the screens. So the second half of that part, I totally agree. They should know exactly which users have access to these screens, and only the users that are authorized to make changes through these screens should have access to them. The first part is customers should eliminate or minimize access to these screens is it needs to be clarified, because in some cases you can't eliminate it. You can only minimize it. So some forms, and I'll just use a couple forms. The define alerts form was one of my favorite examples. That most organizations deploy alerts for a lot of different reasons, and there's some group of people that have access to the alerts form, often on a permanent basis, sometimes just on a temporary basis while a change ticket's been approved. And absolutely, it should be restricted to just those people that understand it. And you know, the define alerts form, as an example, most organizations have done a good job of securing to a small group of developers that typically do that type of migration production. But there's 50-plus forms that now are on the list that Oracle has, and the full list of this document has moved from Appendix B of this Secure Configuration Guide to its own document in and of itself, now contained in MOS Note 1334930.1. And it breaks up, there's a few other things that they have in there that are important, but it breaks it up into professional forms as well as OA framework pages that have similar risks. So here's some examples of the forms. It's not a complete list. This is more focused on the forms. There's a couple OA framework pages in here. But there's some things that you might recognize in here: define concurrent programs, executables, user profile options, alerts. There's a few things that really aren't on this list that we've identified, and a couple things, for example, is bomb deletion statements is not on their list. It's not in the document they put out. So we regularly identify the list, and we supplement the list that they have with our list that's put out in the internal controls repository. So the point being there that there's a good starting point for what they have. If you are an end user of the applications, you can get access to our internal controls repository. And when we uncover a new SQL form or a form that allows SQL injection of some sort, or has that significant security deficiency, we'll put it out there, screenshots of it, and then we'll add it to our list in the internal controls repository. Now, the original list and this original topic was developed by Integrity. Integrity is a key partner of ours, and we use them on various consulting engagements, or we co-team on several consulting engagements. But if you look back at the original copyright, it says excerpts of the document and request reproduce with permission from Integrity. I will give Oracle a little bit of credit. I used to be pretty hard on this topic, and they seem to have advanced quite a bit over the last couple of years in providing more visibility to this activity, and they're doing a better job, I think, of keeping up. But they don't have a complete list. I don't know why this isn't kind of in their standard protocol for analyzing when new forms and activity goes into development, but they seem to miss things and not get this document updated. I think, frankly, that's why they changed the name of the document from the best practices document to a secure configuration, because they didn't want to imply that the document was complete. And the using of the term best practices certainly implies that if you follow that you're following best practices and it's complete. So the real risk there is we're going to look at two examples today, or the execution of SQL statements. And in one case we're doing an update statement. In one case we're calling a function. In some forms you can actually use operating system scripts as well. So the overall risk down below is fraud, data theft, taking over powerful accounts like resetting passwords to SYSADMIN like we're going to look at today, circumventing policy such as change management. These things can be done anonymously and circumvent your change management process altogether, or even your things that aren't going through change management but are critical from a data perspective, as we'll see in example 1, the maintaining of bank accounts. This certainly could lead to internal controls deficiencies, additional audit fees, as I mentioned, because of lack of reliability in application controls. So we're going to push out poll 3 next, and poll 3 is specifically looking at your understanding of SQL Forms. So that is out there now. And we know we asked you this a little bit of the in the sign-ups for the webinar, but I'm just trying to poll again who's on the line here. The following represents my understanding of SQL Forms prior to this webinar. I was fully aware of the risks. I was not aware that SQL, SQL, or OS scripts could be executed using these forms. I was not aware of the number of forms with these risks. I didn't know anything about SQL Forms or other. So this is a quick, brief poll. We won't take a lot of time to dwell on this topic. But again, if you're needing CPE, it's important that you respond to this. So we're getting a good percentage of people. 29% said was fully aware of the risk related to this. About 42% of you say was not aware of the number of forms. And 21% that didn't know anything about SQL Forms. So I'm glad we are helping many of you understand the nature of this risk maybe for the first time. So I'll give you about 5 more seconds here. If you haven't logged something on this, please do. We've got our attendance has grown. That's good. We're up to 46 by now. So that's a pretty good turnout for the webinar. I appreciate you guys turning out today. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. 29%, 11% not aware that SQL scripts or OS scripts could be executed using these forms. That's a pretty that's a low number, but a very high risk associated with it. So hopefully we will take you through some ways that you can mitigate some of these risks as the rest of the presentation goes on. So we're going to go through 2 quick examples. These are some old examples. Again, back from when we originally did this webinar in 2009, but it's still very relevant. The first one is the update of a bank account to a fraudulent bank for the purpose of misdirecting payments to a valid supplier. And the second one is resetting SYSADMIN login. We could reset any login we wanted, but SYSADMIN is a seated user that comes embedded in the application and often has powerful access. It's embedded with a system administrator responsibility, which gives them the right to make updates to security, assign users responsibilities and such. So it's kind of one of the most powerful application logins that you can have. So those are the 2 examples. The first example, we're going to be using the alerts form. And what we have here is a simple SQL statement that we've embedded. So in an alert, you can have there's a variety of different things that you can do to trigger an update statement. In this case, it's an on-demand alert. So we're embedding a SQL statement here, and what we're so let me start over here. So what we're saying here is where we're accessing a particular form. We want a particular process to happen or trigger and fire behind it. So when an execution of the select statement happens, then we want a SQL statement script to be executed. So if I go back to this first form, where the bank account information is 620, where we're selecting that, we go into the form. we want to update that bank account number from 620 at the end to set it to 619, where that particular value is 620. So in essence, when we go into the form and query the form, so the select statement's executed, then this update statement happens automatically. We could have easily have done a background job to run the same type of update script. This just happens to be an on-demand action, or it's fired by the select statement. So before the alert in this form, you can see the value of the bank account on the left here. I'm using my mouse here as 619, and the timestamp on this is 6th of August 2008, 1841. So the date on the timestamp is 1841. So when the alert is fired, this background process is set to run this. The bank account information is changed from 619 to 620. Now, if there was a full audit trail of this activity happening behind the scenes, and that change was made from 619 to 620, or some other fictitious number, then there's a chance that somebody would catch this before the payment process would be sent to the bank, or the EFT file would be sent to the bank. In this case, the record, if you see, the timestamp is still 1841.02. So this particular way of updating the data through this alerts form, because if I go back to the update statement doesn't say update the last updated by date or the last updated by person. It just says just update the bank account information, and that's all this statement does. So if we look at the after results again, we see the value after the alert is 620, but the updated by value, the updated date hasn't changed. So in essence, through the execution of this alert, they've been able to change a bank statement account that could be used in an ACH process or an EFT process paying a vendor, and there would be no audit trail. There would be no visible way for you to see that data being changed at the database layer, absent the use of a log or a trigger-based auditing tool. So from a fraud perspective, a huge risk. You know, if I go back to that alert process, that execution of that update statement, it could be an insert, could be an update, it could be a delete. That could change any data in any table throughout the application. There is no restrictions at all. That form has full, what we would call full apps privileges, which means it can execute any DML statement to update data. So if you're an auditor, if you've just seen this for the first time, and you're thinking you make payments electronically, if you don't have a trigger or a log-based auditing solution in place to be able to monitor that activity, you are completely vulnerable to this scheme from a fraud perspective. So the result of example one, the obvious result is bank fraud, theft of assets, which could happen. And you know, there are mitigating controls that are in place. If a vendor doesn't get paid, eventually down the road they're going to say, "Why didn't I get paid? You promised me payment for X date, it didn't come through." And then, you know, 30, 60 days, it could be, I don't know how long, depending upon the vendor that was being used, that will eventually get identified as it went to the wrong bank account. By that point, who knows what's happened with the money. And so, and obviously it's a detective control. The point really being is you want to prevent that. You want to put a preventive control in place. So the other elements here that are really kind of critical from a high-risk fraud perspective, supplier address, if you have, and supplier name if you're paying by check, remit to addresses on AR invoices where they're going to send their checks for payment, addresses for customer deliveries. So if you're a goods-related company and you're shipping goods to customers, where those goods are delivered, location of where goods are delivered on purchase orders. So if you've got incoming shipments, those could be redirected to a fictitious location. And then the last one, bank account for direct deposits on payroll. So those are some of the higher risk areas that you as auditors would probably understand are pretty critical from a fraud perspective. So before we get into controls on what we should be doing in response to this, we're going to look at a second example. in this case, the second scenario is resetting the sysadmin password. So in this case, I'm logged in here as sysadmin, and this particular environment had a lot of access for the sysadmin login. This is well in excess of the access that they should have. But in a lot of organizations, we do find that DBAs use, who typically own the sysadmin login, or your security administrators who own the sysadmin login, they use the sysadmin login for maintenance. Now, we don't recommend that. We have very specific controls we like to see related to the sysadmin login. But we often find that organizations do use it for maintenance, and that's why they have a lot of access like this. So this next example is, if I go back to the first example is something that typically an IT user would have. So you have a developer that typically maintains the alerts process. The second example is something that an end user would have. So if you're using the quality module, or I could easily have used the bomb deletion group form in the bill of materials of the bombs module, which is another form that end users have. But this example would be if you're using the quality module, or if not using the quality module, but somehow get access to this form in a production environment, doing essentially the same thing we saw earlier, full access using the collection plans process. So this is the basic setup of a collection plan. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. The net result is when you set a plan, the action related to that plan, execute a SQL script or execute an OS operating system script. Those are two things that can be done through this form. In this case, the form, the top half sets the condition for the trigger. The bottom half defines the action. So where a comment on the top equals to hack, so if somebody enters a comment through this quality plan as hack, then it would trigger a SQL statement. In this case, is what we're entering here. So in this case, the SQL statement is an executing a particular package, the FND user package, and the update user process. So in this case, we're calling this particular package to update the sysadmin login and reset the unencrypted password, which is where it's stored, to welcome123. So the net result is, we go in, we enter the results, we enter into the comments hack, that kicks off a background process that runs, and the net result would be the sysadmin password has been reset. So the question would be then, what's the end result? What could they do with the access to the sysadmin password? Now, we could have easily have reset any other password in this example. We could have reset the password for the AP manager or a GL manager, a buyer, a controller, anybody else. So it would allow them to really take over anybody else's identity and then log in through that other person and commit fraud. And then, when the fraud would be uncovered, the person that, even if you had a good control in place, it would look like the other person did the fraud, the person whose account was taken over. So password resets in general are very high risk, but this shows the example. So there's a wide variety of things we put on here as risk. I think you probably understand the risk. I'm not going to belabor that. So poll 4 here, before we get into controls, represents the maturity of my organizations. This is kind of asking the questions a little bit different than we had in the prior one of my organizations related to SQL Forms. We're limiting access to known relevant SQL Forms. We're limiting access to all SQL Forms. All activity regarding SQL Forms go through change management. We've got a monitoring process in place. The fourth one, we're reconciling actual activity to approved activity. So again, we're kind of just getting a feel for where you are in the context of how you've implemented certain controls. And we'll talk about specific controls here in a minute, but needless to say, I mean, there's 50+ forms that are all can be accessible. Not all those forms get used in your environment. So what you're really trying to do is for the forms that are being used is to isolate the forms to make sure that only the people that are authorized to make changes to those forms have access to them. And those that don't, that aren't needed, those aren't assigned initially, and they also are not assigned on an ongoing basis, or there's no change to a menu to add those, or there's a patch doesn't come in and apply a patch to add access to a form that has those abilities. So there's multiple ways. It's not just a once and done type of thing where if you have good security in the front end, you've isolated it, you're free and clear. There's multiple things that you have to continue to monitor on an ongoing basis. So it looks like about 20% of you are limiting access, 11% say all activities going through SQL Forms, 11% say you're monitoring activity via log-based or trigger-based solution, and about 56% of you are saying none. So maybe you have some work to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. You'll last 1 second here to log your response. Okay, so now we are going to look at the meat of this, which is what are the best practices related to SQL Forms. And there's a couple variations, if you would, of how you could manage this. You could do preventive controls on the access side. You could do preventive controls on the database side. Well, this is the process that we recommend. There's always minor deviations to this process, but you know, if you want to go through specifically and have a discussion on this, I'm happy to talk about it offline, but this is kind of what we typically recommend to clients. So the first thing is tightly controlling access to just the users managed and approves as having access. So the first thing you would do is use an SOD tool or a SaaS service to find out who exactly has access to these forms. And then you go back to management and say, okay, we've got 50-plus forms that are the population. We've got 10 of these that are assigned in a production environment, and these are the users that have access to these 10. Are these users authorized to use these forms and make changes to these forms data in a production environment? The answer is yes. You clear the first hurdle. The second thing is developing a change management process that clearly defines and trains those people who have access to those forms that all activities should go through the change management process. Now, here's the thing that is kind of the challenge. Some organizations will give them access to these forms on a permanent basis. We often come in, and I'll use the Alert Manager form, and there's a whole group of people. There's 3 or 4 or 5 people that have access to the Alert Manager on a regular basis. So the question is, how do you monitor, if the policy says all activities should go through a change management process, how do you monitor that they're following that policy? That's really the challenge for organizations. The next element here down before we get into that topic is all code going through those forms should be subject to a peer review before it's entered. So in theory, what I like to see on these forms is that people don't have permanent access in a production environment, but they're given access to these once the change management process has been approved. So that would mean you're limiting the time you've got to focus on the changes made through these forms. You would have the ability to go through a peer review, and they would tell you exactly what's happening, what they're going to do in the production environment in these forms. That would be part of the change ticket. That would be part of your testing process, in your user acceptance process. And then you'd have something then to go back and say, okay, we've gone through this, all the change management process, the paperwork is done, peer review is done, we've got exactly what's going to be executed in a production environment, it's all documented. You grant them access to the production environment, they make the changes, and then you have some certainty that, at least at that time, that they are only you hope to have some certainty that they're only making the changes that they're authorized to make at the time. The reality is, though, once they have access to that in a production environment, and certainly if they have access on an ongoing basis or a permanent basis in a production environment, you still want to have visibility to make sure they didn't do something while they're in there doing something legitimate, that they didn't do something that was not legitimate, not authorized, or that was fraudulent. So the last element of this is you want all activity within those forms to be audited using either a trigger or log-based solution. And then because of the risks associated with this, you should be tracing that activity from system-based audit logs, which is either generated by a trigger log-based auditing solution, and then tracing those back to your change management documentation, your change tickets, to make sure what was done was only what was approved. And to the extent that there is any authorized changes, hopefully they're not fraud, but they're just something simple like documentation isn't complete, the appropriate actions must be taken to plug the holes. So that's it at a higher level. There's other things you can do beyond this. This is the basics. You can put preventive controls in, both at the database level. You can put preventive controls through the user access process. Certainly, there's some things you need to do to make sure that people don't get access to this when you're patching. So there's a whole process related to that. You'd want to rerun your analysis on this every time you're implementing any major application patches, those type of things. But if you have this structure in place, and in particular if you have that trigger-based auditing solution, which is our favorite technology, in place, even to the extent that somebody gets access to these, because you're monitoring these on a regular basis and you're tracing them back to your change management process, unauthorized access or unauthorized changes will get caught. That's kind of the catch-all, and it's the most important part of this control process. So I just want to acknowledge here that originally these slides, when I did in 2009, were done by a good friend of mine, Daryl Gariel, who's a partner in Novilla, so I'm giving him kudos and credits for helping me co-develop this material. And we're now going to get into the Q&A section. So if you have questions on this topic, please submit them. We have 5 or 6 minutes, so it certainly can go a few minutes long on the Q&A side. And I will, as you guys are thinking about questions related to this topic, push out poll 5 real quick, and then I've got a couple other wrap-up slides, so don't go away here. So we're looking at certainly record you on the poll. If you will have any follow-up from today's webinar, again, if you didn't assign the first poll or respond to the first poll, you need a CP certificate, you can respond here. If you want to have a call with myself to talk about these topics, understand available monitoring tools, or even a demo of available monitoring tools, we certainly can do that. So while this poll is done, I'm just going to look at my next couple of slides here. I'll give you another few seconds here to respond to this. If you need CPE, looks like a lot of you are putting your vote in for that, which is good. And even if it's not you that's responsible, if you're an auditor, if it's not you that's responsible for implementing these controls, if you want to have a follow-up call with me, let's say you want to have a call with your IT management or your DBAs or whoever's in charge of your IT controls or IT quality assurance. If you want to have a call, I'm happy. I always say the first hour call is always free, so it's kind of an offer we always do. And I'm more than happy to set up a call with you and some of your team members to go through this, either the scaled-down version of this. These will be available via a recorded webinar, too, so you can pass on the link to some of the other people in your organization. And then we can have a follow-up call after that. We could certainly look at what your options are from a controls perspective. If you want me to critique your controls, you've got some documentation I'm going to look at. I can do that in the first hour as well. So looks like most of you have voted that have wanted to vote here, so I'm going to close this down and just do a couple of wrap-up slides here before we finalize today and get into Q&A. So, and these slides will be sent to you and will be available on our website with the recorded version. So that's one of the questions we often get. So if you're interested in a couple more webinars. We've got a webinar series kind of extending this topic, but we're going to bring in Steve Coates from Integrity, one of our key partners, and we're going to do 3 more webinars coming up, March, April, and May. The next one, we're going to do kind of intro to the series, hidden security threats. In April, we're going to talk specifically about sensitive administrative pages. We're going to talk about some examples of some of the OA framework issues that we looked at today. Much more detail than we can get into in this hour. And then on Thursday, in May, we're going to look at the ongoing password encryption risk, which we found that a lot of organizations are still struggling with, which is another way of gaining backdoor access to accounts, decrypting passwords in production environment, and taking over powerful accounts, which leads to a lot of vulnerabilities. So I'm just going to leave my contact information here up, and I'm going to turn the call, I guess, over to Phil, and Phil can ping me with a couple questions that came up in the webinar.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Numerous questions here. The first one is, what is your preferred solution, logs or triggers, and why?
By far, the use of triggers is the better technology. We actually have implemented a solution from Chaosys, a solution called CS Audit, several times. And the reason we like the trigger-based auditing solutions over the log-based is the log is the building of metadata. That's really it. The log-based solutions don't provide the ability to do metadata. So the metadata mapping and predefined content would say we're looking for these tables and this data. And what we mean by metadata is being able to pull in data from other tables. So one of my best examples I would say is like a change to the menu table, F&D menus. There's actually, when you go into the menus form, there's actually 3 different tables that get updated. There's a menu, F&D menus, menus_TL, and menu entries. So for example, if somebody makes a change to menu entries, I'll want to have the menu name and the user menu name, and those are both stored in 2 other tables. One stored in the F&D menus_TL, and one stored in the F&D menus. So I want that audit trail when it's being developed to be something that's actionable. So it has all the data that I need to be able to then trace it back to the change management to say this was a properly approved or it wasn't improperly approved change management ticket. So those are a couple of reasons. We have a good relationship with Chaosys, and we can get an auditing solution up really within a couple of weeks, even into production environment, depending on your change management process. So that's our favorite solution.
All right, next question. How would you easily identify the actual activity with SQL Forms?
So the activity is really identified through the use of a trigger. So the first thing we would do is identify, well, if you had a solution for access controls, if you had an SOD monitoring solution, then we would talk about limiting access to just put in preventive control potentially on who can get access to certain forms that you aren't thinking you're using or shouldn't be using. To the extent that those are, that we've identified that population 5, 10 forms, 15 forms, whatever it is you guys use in your environment, then we deploy that trigger-based auditing solution on those tables at the table level, and that becomes the basis for having the information we need to actually see what changes are being made, and we would put a process related to tracing those back to your change management system. Hope that answers the question.
Next question. Are there forms that you have identified that Oracle doesn't have in their document?
Yeah, there have been some that we've had over time. As a matter of fact, I'm happy to see the latest version of their form came out with the quality, the collection plans and the quality module. We've had that out there for a long time. It's been 3 or 4 years at least since we've identified that. They finally added that in the new release in 2011. I think it was October 2011. There's one form out there, the bomb deletion statements, that's not on there. And there's one auto accounting form, I think, is another one that I can think of. So if you're an end user, if you're not a part of the internal controls repository, we try to put those in there as we identify those, just so you have them, and you can get ahead of your auditors and put those controls in place before your auditors identify those as risks.
Okay. Next question. Our audit department says that if we look for commit, that is the action we should be concerned with. If we are monitoring for this, do we need to look for insert, update, or delete?
Well, I think we're talking the same thing there. A commit is a transaction that is, it's an interesting question because it highlights that there is this distinct application layer where somebody's doing data entry through the forms, and then when they do a commit, that commits that data entry to the database. So that's probably what your audit department means by a commit. That commit could be an insert, an update, or a delete. If you're committing a new record, you're entering a new record, that commit would be an insert. If you're updating an existing record, that commit would be an update. Or if you're deleting a record, that commit would be a deletion. So I think in this case, we're talking apples to apples. It's just a slightly different language in that terminology.
Okay. Next question. Do you have a vendor that offers a trigger-based solution that you like best, and why?
Yeah, and I did mention Chaosis. We're a key partner with them. We've actually got a lot of predefined content that comes available in their product, and we can get a trigger-based auditing solution up and running in a very short period of time. One of the primary reasons we like these Chaosis is, as opposed to some other solutions in the marketplace, it doesn't require any additional hardware, so it installs directly in the application server, the database server. There's no additional hardware like the Oracle product requires. It's all forms-based. It's very intuitive to use. It uses the same look and feel, the same screens that users are used to using, and it's fairly simple, mature, and robust product. So that's our favorite. There are others that we've implemented, but if that's definitely the easiest and more often than not the most cost-effective solution as well for us to recommend.
All right, another question for you. Can activities in SQL Forms be set to be effective only after authorization by a supervisor? If so, where can we set it?
I think the question really, I think we've seen solutions, I think in an SAP environment that does that has the triggers in essence dormant until a certain process is enabled, like somebody's given access to that. I don't like that process, frankly, because it doesn't allow for a complete audit trail. So if the triggers weren't enabled, just because you think there's only a certain process that somebody can use to update the data doesn't necessarily mean that's the only process. And an example I guess I would give you is, well, number one, direct database access. So as we've talked about in webinars with Integrity in the past, there's a lot of vulnerabilities at the database level. So if you have your database accounts aren't secured, your seeded database accounts aren't secured, as an example, somebody could log into your AP schema account and they would have access to your AP accounts. And you wouldn't think that would be something that you wouldn't anticipate that being the case, so you may not have turned on the trigger during that time frame. So if you're only turning on for the expected time frame, what I'm trying to say is it means that the unexpected, which is really what you're worried about more often than not, the unexpected time frames, that audit trail won't be kept. Now, having said that, I think the reason why organizations like to only turn them on conditionally is they think there's going to be a performance issue, and so they only want the risk of a performance issue to be during a certain time frame. And the reality is when we implement a solution like this, and everything we looked at today, the alerts form, the quality form, the collections plan, those type of thing, and I think virtually everything on Oracle's list, I have to go back and look at it recently, but virtually everything on their list are low volume forms, and most of them are non-transactional, if not all of them are non-transactional. So your performance risk concern, which is one of the other questions we often get on triggers, is really only a concern if you deploy those on tables that have a very high volume of transactions related to them. And even then still, there's ways you can mitigate that risk. So we don't recommend the temporary access type solution. It happens to be the solutions we implement don't have those features anyway. So, but even if they did, we wouldn't use them.
All right, Jeff. I think that just about wraps it up.
Okay. Well, sounds good. If there's any other questions, we can certainly get back to you one-on-one basis. And the contact information here, my phone number, my email address is available, so you can contact me and we can set up a one-on-one call. Hopefully this was good. We appreciate your time today, everybody, and we're going to pause just for a minute and leave this slide up here if you want to jot notes down, but otherwise we're about done with the webinar. So thanks. We look forward to seeing you at March's webinar. Have a good day.